Well, hello and welcome to an episode of Camilla and I. And today's episode is on equipment, and it's whether you need a gimbal head for your wildlife photography. So let's dive straight in. What is a gimbal head and what does it do? How to use one? What is the cost of one? What are the advantages to using one? And what are the pros and cons? The gimbal head is a clever piece of metal engineering which uses bearings and arms in order to support your heavy lens and camera for wildlife photography, which allows you to quickly and smoothly point the camera in any direction where your subject may be flying or moving. Particularly useful for fast flying subjects, i.e. birds in flight. You can track these across the sky, and it's a very good system. To use a gimbal head, you first have to balance it so that it's fully adjustable, and this is quite a simple process, and it's still very important to get it absolutely balanced in order to free up the motion, and so it just stops in any position. Once you've got used to it, you just set it towards your heaviest lens and it's easy to set. So what does a good gimbal head cost? Well, how long is a piece of string? Not quite that question, but gimbals tend to go for around about £400 to £600 depending on the make. The Siru PH20, the one I use, is £429 at the moment at Castle Cameras. Grab it quick while you can because your local shops are disappearing fast. One has already gone in Salisbury. So link to Castle Cameras. So yeah, a good gimbal head is going to set you back a fair bit of money. So is it worth it? It is a consideration. So we will see. And the legs, to support it, a good set of heavy legs could set you back up to £800. So we're looking at a combination for a gimbal setup. You're looking at around £1,000 mark. So it's not a decision to take lightly. So watch on. So why bother? What are the advantages of using a gimbal head? Well, you can be waiting around a long time for 2 seconds of action, and it's very useful to have something already pointing in the right direction and in line with your subject or in the general area of your subject. And on a gimbal this is possible. You're pointing roughly in the right direction, and you should be pre-focused if you've watched earlier episodes of Camilla and I, and all the weight is taken off your shoulders and you can operate the camera with 2 hands. A very useful consideration, especially for birds in flight. So it's easier to pre-focus, and it's quicker in a predefined area. There's no two ways about it. You can acquire focus a lot quicker with a gimbal head, and it's a much more smooth motion. You can go through a full, usually a 90-degree arc in a smooth panning motion, which is very useful, especially when you're using the slower shutter speeds for more imaginative wildlife photography. So before we get too carried away with the gimbal and rushing down to Castle Cameras to buy one, I must mention a few drawbacks. Firstly, you have to get this set up into position, which is no mean feat in itself. I mean, we are carrying out another piece of heavy metal, so it's a good point to plan your visit. This is for ideal use in a hide situation or where you're setting up for a known existing setup somewhere you visited before. As an example of pre-planning, I had a sandpiper come into the field of play the other day, and it was directly beneath the hide. Well, on this occasion I'd particularly gone light and I hadn't taken the gimbal with me, which on this occasion proved to be advantageous because the sandpiper flew in directly beneath the hide. And if I'd been pre-positioned with the gimbal setup, it would have been impossible for me to do that out of the hide in the position I was in the hide. So the flexibility of not having the camera on a gimbal enabled me to get the sandpiper shot, or linked sandpiper shot. So this is again a consideration. To get this off the gimbal in time in order to photograph that sandpaper, I would have had to have done this manoeuvre and done like so, which is possible, but in the circumstances it's another action you have to take, and this sandpaper was not around for too long. Fortunately it didn't see me, and you have to be quite stealthy, and obviously any movement in the hide would have alerted it, so it would have been off. So a consideration. So for long spells in the field, it's definitely worth it, and it's probably your best option by far. You have time to compose and think about your shots as well. Just like a landscape, the best landscapes are taken on support, and it's the same with wildlife photography. Your best shots are taken on some sort of support, a tripod, monopod. 90% of the shots I take, I'd say, that are any good are taken on some sort of support, and probably about 10% are taken on this setup that with the gimbal head. So obviously, as usual on Camilla and I, the more support the better. You may have seen the background today. Anything that supports the camera for wildlife photography is well worth investing in. But this is definitely not a cheap option, and it's not for your sort of beginner or amateur. It's more a sort of professional level, pro amateur level, and it's not, with today's stabilisation, do you need it? And you know, there are alternatives, there are cheaper alternatives. A monopod with a swivel head, you can obtain a similar designed effect. It's not as good, it's not as smooth, it's not as supportive, but you can see. So link to monopod and a monopod, or a monopod with 3 feet earlier video, must mention that one. So do you actually need a gimbal head? Well, I would argue that it does have its uses, and it's very, very good. So personally, I would have one. Pros for using a gimbal head are basically it's great support, and it's a lovely fluid motion for panning. See that Canada Goose photo? I'll link to Canada Goose photo. Less upper body workout. It's definitely, you don't have to do so many hours in the gym. It does take all the weight off the shoulders, so it's very useful. 2 hands free to operate the camera. The cameras these days are so technical, it's very nice to have both hands at play on the body. And subjects are always in line of sight of the gimbal. Obviously, if you've pre-focused, preset, and you've got more time for composition and thought, so it's well worth it. Judge for yourselves. What I'll do is I'll put a montage of photos that I've taken earlier with a gimbal at the end of this video. So the disadvantages of a gimbal head are that it's another bit of kit to carry around, and you're certainly not as flexible as handheld, as demonstrated by the sandpiper earlier. Another expense to add to your growing list of wildlife photography needs. So always a good point. And it's not as responsive in certain situations, so you have to bear that in mind. You have to be in a sort of hide or pre-planned set situation. And also, I haven't mentioned up to now, but there are alternatives. See Andy Rouse, he does a very good flexi pro shooter option, which is different to a gimbal, but it operates very similarly to a gimbal, and I'm very interested in one. Perhaps I could challenge Andy to go against my gimbal, and then he could show the full force of his pro shooter setup. I'm very interested in the fluid motion and the lighter weight of the sort of bull head pro flexi shooter. Anyway, I'll put a link to his videos in the description, so you can check that one out for yourself. So that is an alternative completely to actually purchasing a gimbal head, but that is of the upper end price level of a gimbal. But it is potentially, it's got pros and cons, but it'd be interesting to test in the field. So Andy, if you fancy a video challenge, perhaps we could go head to head with a Flexi Pro shooter. We always like a challenge on Camilla and I. Okay, so everyone wants to know, I suppose, how much do I use 9? Well, not as much as I'd like these days, mainly because I'm bringing you along with me, and it's forced me to buy a fluid head, which is one of these video things. Oh, where is it? Oh, it's there. I'll put another picture of it. Massive big thing, almost as big as a or as heavy as a gimbal head, and I tend to use that for videoing these days. So yeah, it's your fault I don't use my gimbal head as much as I would, or I could. So yeah, I'm blaming you lot. Anyway, and it's still a very good option. A fluid head for video work is very good, and the fluid head I use is the can't remember, what was it? Oh yeah, it's the VH10X. So yeah, don't get that one, far too expensive. Anyway, the head I use on the gimbal I use is the Sirui PH20. Very fluid, very well built, superb option. Another one of my Sirui range, so I can thoroughly recommend it. But also, this can be mounted, the PH20 can be mounted on another one of my secret weapons, is the ground pod, the Eckler cam disc ground pod, and this whole gimbal setup can be mounted on the actual cam disc, and then you can have low level shooting with the flexibility of up and down movement like so. I'll link to a couple of pictures I've taken with that setup, particularly useful when you're at ground level and birds take off lying flat down. Very interesting. So a link to a description there. Anyway, as usual on Camilla and I, the choice is yours. I mean, it's an expensive bit of kit. I'm not saying rush out and buy a gimbal head. It's certainly not a cheap option, not to be taken lightly. And it's good stabilisation techniques, modern cameras, monopod. You can achieve an awful lot without going to the expense of purchasing a gimbal head. But it is a very useful option, and it's there, it's available, and yeah, I thought I'd better point out the pros and cons. So as usual, you know, if I've been any assistance, if I've saved you £1,000, or you're rushing out and buying £1,000 worth of more gear, blame me in the comments below, or praise me in the comments below, don't care. Either or, and don't forget, as usual, stay alert and stay safe in your wildlife photography. Be careful, have a good one, and bye from Camilla and I. See you in the next one.